Okay.
Okay, welcome to the first day of the capstone peer review presentations for Geography 596A, summer 2023. I just want to make sure that I get a recording going. Fritz, were you able to? Yes, it looks like you were. Cool. Okay, anyway, I'm Jim Detweiler, the faculty lead for the Geospatial Programming Certificate. For those of you who don't know me, I'll be the MC for today. A few reminders before we get into the presentations. Presenters, you're going to have 25 minutes to give your talk, followed by 5 minutes of questions. Folks in the audience, if you have a question for a presenter, please enter it into the chat box. You might consider putting your question in a separate text editor, then copying and pasting it into the chat box when the presenter wraps up so that you don't distract them during their talk. Presenters, please read the questions out loud so that anyone watching the recording will know what you're responding to. If you're a 596A student, we're expecting you to provide each speaker with some constructive feedback. Others who are attending, you're invited to do so also. I'll post the link to the peer review form in the chat box soon. Presenters, please also share your email address through the chat box in case anybody has any follow-up questions. Okay, first up, we have Renee Lindstrom, who's going to talk to us broadly on the topic of transportation planning. Renee, are you all set?
Yes, thank you so much. I believe I am all set. So thanks in advance for your time today. I appreciate your feedback and your time in listening to my presentation. My name is Renee Lindstrom, and I am currently employed at the City of Tampa, where I'm a GIS analyst, and I work in the Transportation Engineering Division of the Mobility Department, and my day-to-day tasks involve using GIS to support transportation planning and asset management. So my capstone project is called Transportation Planning, Visualization of Citizen Concerns in a Local Government Agency, and it centers on creating a GIS tool for transportation planners that will help them better understand the types of concerns that citizens are reporting and how they relate to existing transportation conditions and priorities, with the ultimate goal of better incorporating these concerns into the design of improvements. So for the background, I'll talk about two different topics here. The first will be a brief description of the characteristics of the City of Tampa and the transportation options within the city. And then secondly, I'll go through a very high-level overview of transportation planning and how citizen concerns get incorporated into projects. So the City of Tampa is located in the state of Florida, and it's part of the greater Tampa Bay region, which includes Tampa, St. Petersburg, and Clearwater. There are close to 400,000 residents within the city, and it covers roughly 175 square miles. So recently, Tampa was named one of the 50 greatest places in the world by Time magazine and has become a very fast-growing region with estimates of a 26% growth rate within the next 20 years. So most of the development and density and growth is happening here in the urban core and is centered on downtown, and it radiates out for about 2 miles. So there's only 2 public transit options in the city, and they consist of a countywide bus system and then a historic streetcar with a 2.5-mile track right in here along the urban core. So unsurprisingly, the main mode of transportation within the city is a single occupant vehicle. And there's a huge need for transportation alternatives because of the rapidly densifying population within this urban core and the increasing popularity of things like e-bikes and scooters. So city leadership and citizens, especially those using the micromobility options, they've appealed to transportation planners to kind of extend and enhance the city's micro-mobility infrastructure. And by that, I mean things like bike lanes and 2-way buffered cycle tracks and enhanced pedestrian crossings, and all things that make it safer for people to get around without a car. So it's also extremely important that I mention that in 2019, Tampa became a Vision Zero city, which is a pretty big deal in the transportation world. If you're not familiar with the Vision Zero movement, It is a worldwide transportation initiative with the overarching goal of reaching zero crashes that result in fatality or serious injury. So there's several tenets to this philosophy, one of which is making improvements to the transportation infrastructure that protects vulnerable road users, which are, of course, pedestrians, cyclists, e-bike, and scooter users. And to jump ahead a little bit, according to my preliminary literature research, I came across an article in the EURESA journal by someone named Schlossberg and a team of authors called Active Transportation and Citizen Involvement. And he made 3 points that were particularly relevant to our situation. He said that transportation decisions are invariably limited by the availability of spatial street data. And an important step in improving micromobility infrastructure is to identify barriers to using active transportation. And then lastly, he said data from the ground level perspective, that person walking down the street is most important, but it is non-existent in most cities because collecting data at this scale is time-consuming and difficult. So as you can see, our transportation planners have a pretty tough job cut out for them. There's a huge emphasis on improving micromobility infrastructure and not very much street level data to inform or defend decision-making. And most planners have day-to-day tasks, such as determining need for improvements, prioritizing projects, and communicating with stakeholders. And determining needs can take a pretty long time. It's definitely challenging given that the data that they have available comes from multiple sources and exists in various formats. And it's not always easy to compile or present this to stakeholders. And in the environment of limited funding, priority must be assigned to some projects at the expense of others. So it's extremely important to be able to explain why you're prioritizing one project over another. And in case you haven't been to any public meetings for transportation projects recently, I'll give you a brief history and then a present day synopsis of how these concerns are incorporated into projects. According to an article that I found published by Arthur Miller in the Journal of Transportation Research Record, in the past, citizen involvement in transportation projects was largely an afterthought. They would finish up the plans first, then hold the public meeting to gather feedback, and then incorporating any of that feedback was pretty difficult because the design plans were already finished. However, in today's world, incorporating citizen feedback is considered crucial to the project's success. And the transportation planners schedule the public meetings first before any design plans are started so that they can actively solicit public input and learn about any of the existing issues in a project area. So designing solutions to these issues is a big part of what makes each project a success. So there are some challenges to incorporating this input, though. Super important to incorporate it, but sometimes when the planners solicit public feedback with a meeting, no one shows up at the meeting and no feedback is provided. And sometimes no one visits the website or fills out the provide your feedback here forms that are hyperlinked. And on the opposite hand, sometimes if the meeting is attended, it's just not representative of the entire population. Special interest groups and neighborhood association presidents can be quite vocal in providing valuable feedback. However, it's not always a full picture. So to augment the solicited sources of public feedback, the transportation planners have been looking for ways to use the observations and concerns that get reported to the city by citizens each day. Every day, people call into the city to report transportation issues, and this is entirely the kind of ground level data that would be useful for improving the micromobility infrastructure. And some examples of the calls that get that come in sound kind of like this. So someone is speeding on my street, and then there needs to be a four-way stop at this block. And I can't let my kid walk to school here because crossing the road at this intersection is unsafe. So these are the kinds of concerns that get called in and cataloged each day. And in the past, these reported concerns were very difficult to aggregate because they were kept in a Word document or an Excel spreadsheet that lived on somebody's, local computer. So additionally, these formats lacked spatial visualization, so determining which areas had which types of concerns was nearly impossible. And so you can kind of see why incorporating these concerns has been challenging in the past. So that brings us to the goal and objective of this project, which is to answer a long-time question asked by transportation planners. How can we better incorporate citizen concerns into transportation projects? And one of the main ways that I want to do that with this project is to compile all the data that the transportation planners use into a single distribution point, including the volunteered citizen concerns, and create a user-friendly web-based dashboard that does not require any specialized training or software installation, and reducing the time investment required to assess types of citizen concerns and their proximity to the existing transportation conditions. So these goals are going to be achieved by creating an Esri web-based dashboard. So there's 5 main steps that will be used to complete this dashboard, and we'll talk about that in the proposed methodology. First step is going to be conducting interviews with the transportation planners to understand which data sets they are currently using and why. So also, what issues are they having with their current workflow, and how do they compare the data when they have a decision to make? And secondly, I'll need to interview the customer service team that for transportation. They are the team that handle the intake of all of the citizen concerns and requests. And I need to figure out how they structure and store that data, since it's the primary source of data that we'd like to gain insight from. And then once these interviews are conducted and the issues are clarified, I'll need to take a look at the native source of the data and determine the best technical approach for pulling it into a dashboard, preferably one without duplication of effort or data entry. And also, of course, review of technical white papers, academic research journals will be needed to support conclusions. And then I'm going to take a look at examples of how some other cities handle citizen transportation concerns also. And then finally, I'll be deploying the citizen concern dashboard for internal use, gathering feedback from end users, and then iteratively improving the functionality based upon user feedback and requests. So as part of my initial research to determine if this was even a viable project, I conducted preliminary literature review and then the interviews with the transportation planners and the customer service team. So in my discussions with the transportation planners, I found out that they used our data from both internal and external sources, and they visit quite a few distribution points to gather this data. So most of the data they use is data that we maintain in-house in our enterprise GIS and consists of transportation assets and prioritized planning layers. Transportation assets include bike lanes, sidewalks, intersection control, such as whether it's an all-way stop or a two-way stop. And the prioritized planning layers include things like a sidewalk gap priority, which is a polylines of high to low priority values assigned to each gap that exists in the existing sidewalk. So if there's, 2 houses that don't have a sidewalk, this gap is prioritized according to its proximity to schools, transit stops, and its overall length and other factors. Also, they use the high injury network, which is a series of roadway corridors that have high rates of crashes that result in fatalities or serious injuries. They also use school zones and speed limits because reducing speed limits is one of the tools that they use to reduce the probability of severe crashes. The planners also take into consideration data that's sourced from outside agencies to better understand safety, equity, and access to transit. So the internal distribution point for this data is an internal facing web app viewer that functions as the GIS data library for the entire mobility department, which incidentally has 5 different divisions. So to get to the data that they regularly use, they have to sift through a long list of nested layers that primarily apply to other divisions. And because this app serves 5 different divisions, tailoring it to their use case is just not really a viable option. And the external data that they use must be gathered from at least 3 different sources. And the information without any specialized GIS software is best viewed in its native web-based interface. And since they don't have the software, there's not really any way to overlay this data with the other internal data that they use. So they're forced to kind of make side-by-side comparisons of screenshots to understand how this data relates to any of the internal data that they use. And then presenting their results to stakeholders can be a little clunky. So I also talked to the customer service team, and they revealed that they received customer concerns from a variety of sources that range from web-based forms, phone calls, administrative requests, and emails. And they reported that they compile all of these requests into our work order management system, CityWorks. CityWorks was recently deployed within our department and is the tracking mechanism for all service requests and work orders. And coincidentally, it also provides spatial location. So when the customer service team receives a request that can't be solved with repair or replacement, it is assigned the status of deferred to planning. And so I'll stop right here for a moment because this is very important to this deferred to planning status. This is what we're going to use to query out and isolate the citizen concerns from the larger group of service requests. Some of the most common concerns that they report receiving are, of course, excessive speeding, the safety for bikes and pedestrians, school zone safety issues. They get sidewalk requests and ADA remediation requests. And so after they go through all this work, this is what it looks like. All the pending service requests are symbolized with just one yellow symbol, and the citizen concerns get lumped in with all the requests for repairs and replacements. So there's also a pretty steep learning curve associated with configuring CityWorks to query out these, a particular status. So if somebody doesn't use this platform on a daily basis and have a sincere interest in learning, the intricacies of how citizen concerns are received, they remain largely inaccessible. And even if a planner went to the trouble to get all of this set up, the requests only have the basic spatial context. They don't have any additional information immediately visible, like what type of concern it is. So in my initial literature review, I came across a white paper from CityWorks that described a supported functionality of an eURL query, which is basically a REST point. It's a REST endpoint for a saved query. So this REST endpoint remains connected to the original CityWorks data, but it can be pulled into an Esri web-based dashboard and symbolized using all the tools available in ArcGIS. And so this way, there will be no duplication of effort when it comes to entering or displaying the citizen requests. And since the city already has an Esri enterprise system and is pretty entrenched in that world, that's why an Esri dashboard was chosen for this project. So the anticipated results will be a citizen concern dashboard that makes it easier for planners to understand the different types of citizen concerns and how they relate to the existing transportation environment. So this dashboard is going to be internal facing and accessible to all members of the organization that have a city login, and there's not going to be any software install or training really needed to be able to use this. So I'll go into a quick demo here to kind of show, instead of creating a wireframe, I just chose to do a mock-up demo here in CityWorks or in Esri. So the transportation concerns that all come in, you can kind of see how many of them there are and how they're scattered throughout the city. And then we can apply some Esri-based symbology here to kind of break out the concerns. So we've got speeding concerns, traffic sign requests, traffic safety concerns, sidewalk installation requests. And as we drill down, we can investigate more information about each one of these requests. So this particular one here looks like a speeding concern. And the idea for this dashboard is to pull these things out and provide them in manageable chunks that the transportation planners are able to digest and present to stakeholders easily. So here's our speeding concerns. We can see the other types of concerns that are nearby. And then as we toggle through with this area, we'll start to pull in some of the other layers that are important to them. So this particular one is the sidewalk gap priority and infill request. So we can see in that area, there's not a whole lot of sidewalk gaps. However, it is close to a transit route. Speed limit there is 30, so maybe bumping it down to 25 might be something they want to consider. It looks like there's a few other speeding concerns in the area. There are a few crashes in the area, and it looks like it's close to our high injury network, which is a county maintained road. And there's not any reported school safety concerns, but it looks like there are some in the area. So that would probably be something they'd want to investigate as well. And same, there's not any bicyclist or pedestrian safety concerns, but it looks like there is a pretty good bike network in the area as well. So this is kind of the idea for the project. It's just to provide a little bit more context for the planners to kind of click through and have at their fingertips for discussion purposes and for stakeholder communication purposes. And the project timeline that I've got proposed, June was research and sourcing data and conducting interviews. July, I'm working on, my peer review presentation right now. And next step will be to incorporate some of the feedback that I've received from the focus user group and this peer review feedback here. I'll incorporate those concerns into the dashboard. And then I will do a conference presentation if I'm accepted to the conference in August. Then I'll revise the dashboard again based upon that conference feedback, and then I will deploy the dashboard for organizational use. And it will be an ongoing iterative process as we receive requests for additional functionality. So the proposed conference that I'd like to present at is the South Florida GIS Expo. I've submitted an abstract and I'm waiting to hear back. And it is sponsored by the Palm Beach County GIS Forum, and attendees will include a large number of local government agencies. So I felt like this was a good venue for this type of presentation because there's probably quite a few that have some of the same concerns that we do. So with that, I will open it up for questions.
All right, nicely done, Renee. Very nice set of slides. I like that.
Thank you.
I'll start off with the with a question. You mentioned that not all of your customer service personnel use CityWorks regularly. I was wondering if you could kind of expand on that, talk about why that is, and how much of a barrier that's going to be to you, implementing your plans here.
Oh, sure, absolutely. I must have misspoke a little bit. What I really meant to say was like, not all of the, transportation planners and engineers use CityWorks regularly. CityWorks, our customer service team, uses exclusively, as well as the operations department that goes out to actually perform the repairs of the potholes and the signs. So they use this on a day-to-day basis, and they're pretty fluent in this system. However, like the planners and the transportation engineers that I work with do not use CityWorks on a daily basis. They know that it exists and they know that it is capable of things, but at this present time, it's just not something that they're going to get into and use on a daily basis. So anyways, this is kind of to bridge that gap and to kind of merge some of this data together so that they can use it and incorporate it in their planning and decision making without having to really get their hands dirty and learn about database querying and setting up the whole CityWorks interface.
Gotcha.
So
makes sense. Looks like you've got a couple of questions / comments in the chat box.
Okay, let me see if I can find them up. Okay. So it's great present. This is from Dr. Kessler, great presentation on an important topic. This is a bit beyond your presentation, but figures into your overall planning vision. At present, do you see any issues where e-bikes fit into the transportation planning? Other cities have wrestled with that idea with respect to bike usage. E-bikes are not quite bicycles, yet they are not quite licensed motorized vehicles. So has there been any discussion where e-bikes, and should they be allowed to travel in your transportation network? I would say yes, we are definitely still having lots of discussions about that. The city of Tampa did recently promote an e-bike program. And so we're still in the process of kind of working out some of those concerns. We have been building more cycle tracks, which are, it's kind of the two-way cycle tracks that are either separated by a curb or cars. And it seems like the e-bikes kind of function okay on that, but I'm sure there's going to be many more discussions in the future regarding that topic. And this is from Elizabeth Day. She says, no question, but thought you might find Seattle's gathering info for revamping its citywide transportation plan interesting. Fantastic. I will check that out. And then here's the info gathering map. That is wonderful. Thank you for providing that resource. We've been looking at Washington, D.C. a lot lately. They have some really interesting things as well, based upon how they aggregate their transportation citizen concerns. And so I'm actually out here at the ESRI conference and got to see the gentleman that designed that website and got to hear his presentation on it. So that was really cool. But thanks for providing that information on Seattle too. That'll be great. And so I think that is the questions that I have in the box.
Yep, you've addressed what's in there so far. Any other questions for Renee? I had another one. You had when you were showing the demo of your dashboard, you had a number of different concern categories there. Are your customer service staff entering, recording what category each concern fits into, or is that something that you're having to go through the data to categorize?
Right now it is constrained with a domain and a drop. So what I kind of see for future improvements is that as this information is used, they'll probably want to refine some of those categories a little bit, but that does make the symbolization easier, having the concerns kind of categorized into those buckets. And that was set up by the customer service center based upon what they normally receive. So, like I said, going forward, there probably will be a few adjustments to that just to further refine some of the data that's coming in. So.
Okay, good. Any other questions for Renee?
Well, thank you so much.
Yes, thank you.
I very much appreciate your time.
Yep, nicely done. Good luck on your project.
Thank you.
Next up, we've got Katie Shen. Katie, are you ready to share your screen?
Yeah, I'm ready.
All right, well, take it away.
So can everyone see my screen?
Not yet. I'm just seeing avatar for you.
Oh no.
Here we go. It's coming in, it looks like. Yep, there it is.
Awesome. And so yeah, good morning, everyone. The topic I will be presenting on is geospatial insights into air pollution and traffic interactions, and exploring statistical and geographic patterns. I'm very excited to share with you the geographical analysis techniques that I will be using in this project. So by the end of this presentation, I hope to equip you with a better understanding of the role that statistical and geospatial analysis can play in discovering data patterns that cannot be easily revealed. So for a brief overview of this presentation, I will cover 4 key sections. First, I will talk a little bit about myself. Then I will dive into the project description, focusing on the scopes and objectives. Next, I will discuss the significance and importance of this project. And lastly, we will explore the methodologies and some of the approaches I will be taking to tackle this project. One thing I have to mention here is that a few parts of this project is written with AI ChatGPT assistance. So a little bit about myself. First of all, my name is Katie. I'm currently living in Canada, city of Toronto. I had my first bachelor's in geophysics, and during my undergrad, I was exposed to a GIS class, and being able to transform a few files to spatially informative maps was eye-widening. So my passion for utilizing technologies to balance geophysics and GIS quickly grew, which led to my second bachelor's in GIS and my current pursuit of master's degree here at Penn State. In addition to my academic career, I currently work as a full-time robotics software engineer. It may not directly align with my passions, but it's an industry with promising growth and potential. In my personal life, I'm a dessert lover. I really think life is too short to skip over dessert. It's the secret ingredient that adds sweetness to every ordinary moment, so never underestimate the power of a delicious treat to brighten up your day. Now you probably know more about me than the project, so let's get into the project. The key objectives I'm hoping to achieve are categorized into 3 sections. The first objective is to conduct an analysis to identify patterns of traffic-related air pollution. Here I'm planning to apply statistical cluster analysis techniques and identify clusters of traffic pollution and examine how they vary across different regions. The second objective is to identify correlations of pollution and geography. My goal is to develop a good understanding of the geospatial distribution of air pollution and its relationship with specific geographic characteristics. In particular, I aim to identify geographic features that exhibit a high correlation between traffic pollution and the surrounding geographical morphologies. And lastly, this project aims to provide valuable insights for future studies. The analysis of the geospatial pollution patterns and correlations can serve as a foundation for future research and analysis. Now we know what this project is, let's get into why this project is important. One crucial aspect of this project is its relevance to public health concerns. Air pollution, particularly that which is related to traffic, has serious effects on human health. By understanding the geospatial patterns of traffic pollution, we can identify areas with higher pollution levels and potential health risks. This can guide policymakers and health professionals to mitigate the negative health impacts of air pollution and improve the overall well-being. The second point emphasizes on the environmental impact of traffic-related air pollution. Air pollution contributes to climate change, ecosystem degradation, and overall environmental deterioration. By learning the correlation between pollution and geography, we can gain insights into whether there are any special geographic characteristics that contribute to higher pollution levels. And lastly, this project has significant implications for urban planning and decision-making processes. Cities face the challenge of managing traffic congestion and improving air quality while accommodating population growth. By analyzing the relationship between traffic volume, air pollution, and geographic features, we can inform urban planners about the geospatial aspects that contribute to pollution hotspots. So moving on to methodology. From a glance, there will be 3 steps in completing this project. The first step is data collection. I will be gathering relevant data sets that include information on air pollution levels, traffic volume, and geographic characteristics of the study area. I will be providing more details in the next couple of slides. Okay, the next component of our methodology is cluster analysis. I will apply statistical techniques to identify clusters of traffic pollution. In this analysis, I will group together areas with similar pollution characteristics, which will pinpoint and provide insights into the spatial distribution of pollution patterns. And lastly, I hope to incorporate the longitudinal analysis if the available data meets the requirements and if the time permits. So going back, let's take a closer look at the data collection process. The first step is to access the availability and accessibility of relevant data related to traffic volume and air pollution levels. This involves identifying and gathering datasets from various sources, such as government agencies and monitoring stations. So for instance, let's consider a potential study area in Alberta, Canada, which I have explored the traffic data repositories from Statistics Canada to ensure that we have access to reliable information. The second picture here shows the air pollution monitoring stations in Alberta retrieved from OpenAQ, which is a nonprofit open source platform that aggregates ground level air quality data across the globe. Since this is an open source platform, the backup plan for this is to retrieve air quality data from the government repositories and open data portals. And lastly, the image here showcases a satellite imagery of Alberta from Google Earth. This imagery provides contextual information and allows us to examine the geographical characteristics of the region. Moreover, we have access to information from the government databases, such as digital elevation maps and digital surface maps, which can further enhance our understanding of the study area. Okay. Let's consider another potential study area in Utah, USA. So I'm not limiting the study area to one location only, because I want to get a variety of different sample locations with different geographic features, so that we can analyze their pollution behaviors. Same things here. The first image shows the traffic monitoring stations, and the data can be downloaded in CSV from the government of Utah. The second image was retrieved from OpenAQ, and the last image was from Google Earth. Next, I will carefully select appropriate study areas for the analysis, and this involves considering factors like, I really wanted to say population density, traffic intensity, etc., but the reality is there's not enough data. Since I can't really go out into the field and collect the data that's most suitable for this project, so I'm limited with what I can find. And this is the reason I need to find a broad selection of study areas to begin with, because some locations may only have data from historical years like 2008, while other locations may have a limited amount of air sensors, which won't make a good sample. So far, I'm able to identify 4 potential study areas. They are Alberta and Ontario from Canada, and Utah, Pennsylvania from the United States. So by carefully choosing study areas that represent different geographical settings, I hope to capture a diverse range of traffic-related air pollution patterns. Another crucial aspect of data collection process is evaluating the quality and comparability of the available data. I will carefully examine the data sources and assess the accuracy, completeness, and reliability of the data sets. This requires assessment. This quality assessment ensures that my analysis is based on reliable and valid information. So what I mean by this is, since my analysis involves studying a broad array of study areas, like I said before, it's important to know that the available data may vary across different regions. I will put some effort into keeping the data range consistent. Okay, data limitations. One of the limitations I'm facing is that I have no control over the data collection. I rely on existing data sets obtained from various sources, So to ensure data quality, I will evaluate the need for enforcing a specified radius constraint depending on the data availability. This constraint will regulate the proximity between air pollution monitoring stations and the traffic flow monitoring stations. So the air pollution measurements likely came from the traffic. Additionally, I will prioritize data comparability by avoiding comparisons between different time scales, say comparing 2022 data to 2023, or sample intervals like daily data compared to monthly data. There are other few limitations we need to acknowledge. Firstly, the meteorological data is not taken into account in this project. While meteorological factors can influence air pollution patterns, we have chosen to focus specifically on the correlation between traffic volume and air pollution levels. Secondly, I aim to statistically control the influence of alternative pollution sources such as land use by emphasizing on the difference in the pollution concentrations over time. So, for example, if there's a factory contributing to the pollution levels, but the factory will always be there. So I'm more focused on the relative pollution concentrations rather than the absolute values. So here are some of the challenges I've encountered when going through the data. It's important to ensure that we have a comprehensive range of pollutants recorded, including particle matter, that's PM, nitrogen dioxide, ozone, or other relevant pollutants. However, the availability of certain pollutant types may vary across different regions or monitoring stations, which can limit the completeness of my analysis. So for example, we have Calgary, Alberta showing ozone and nitrogen dioxide levels recorded for June 2022. It is evident by the graph there's a negative relationship between the two pollutants, so I may be able to draw some analysis from here. However, when I dig into Salt Lake City, it only shows records of PM10. As a result, these two data sets are not directly comparable, which limits the ability to draw direct correlations. Luckily, while going through another region called Medicine Hat, I've found ozone data, which allows me to establish parallels and make meaningful comparisons with the findings from Calgary. Likewise, we encountered a similar scenario with data from Spanish Fork, Utah. In this data set, we have access to nitrogen dioxide data and PM25 data, which allows us to establish comparisons with other data sets and draw some insights. Another challenge I encountered relates to the time range of the collected data. I understand ensuring a consistent time range is crucial for accurate analysis and comparison, but the reality is the data may cover different time periods, such as months, years, or specific seasons. These variations in the time range can pose challenges when attempting to identify temporal patterns and correlations. So for example, PM25 data from Medicine Hat and nitrogen dioxide data from Spanish Fork only covers until mid-June instead of spanning the entire month. So I will address this challenge by carefully selecting a relevant and consistent time range, or I can aggregate the data to account for the variations. The proximity of air pollution monitoring stations to traffic volume stations also presents a challenge. It is important to consider the spatial relationship between the two types of stations. It is to ensure that the collected data is representative of traffic conditions in the area of interest. However, due to logistical constraints, there will be variations in the proximity between the monitoring stations and the actual traffic sources. These variations can introduce potential biases in the analysis. I will carefully assess the need to enforce a radius constraint to account for these spatial challenges if the data permits. So I've been talking about air pollution data. Now I'm going to make the flip to talk about traffic volume data. One of the challenges is the availability of traffic data from different sources. I've gathered traffic data from government agencies, transportation departments, or third-party sources, and each source has its own unique collection method. data format and quality standards. So it will take a little bit of work to organize them into the same format. Traffic volume data can vary in terms of measurement units or aggregation levels, such as hourly, daily, or monthly averages. These variations can pose challenges when attempting to compare between data. So I will address this challenge by standardizing the data, converting units if necessary, and aggregate the data to a common frequency such as weekly for comparisons across region. And last point, same thing here. Like we talked about with air pollution data, I wanted to emphasize on assessing whether or not we need to enforce a radius constraint between the two stations to eliminate potential bias in analysis. So let's examine two examples we previously mentioned, Calgary and Spanish Fork. These two datasets exhibit distinct standards and characteristics. In Calgary, the data was collected from Statistics Canada. The CSV files provided the geographic coordinates, and the data was recorded on a daily basis. The time range of the data spanned from February 2022 to April 2023. On the other hand, the traffic data from Spanish Fork was downloaded from the government of Utah. The download did not include any spatial information, so it required manual extraction of geographic coordinates from the pop-up windows on the map. The data was recorded on an hourly basis and organized into multiple CSV sheets. For a better visualization, as illustrated on the bottom graphs, each graph represents a specific date, June 1st, 2nd, and 3rd, and so on. And Spanish Fork dataset covered a different time range, specifically from January 2022 to September 2022. Consequently, I need to carefully determine the date range that spans over the majority of the available datasets. So in this section, we will explore the statistical cluster analysis approach I'm planning to use in this project. I begin by grouping the data within each city location, disregarding the longitudinal aspects. This allows us to focus on the patterns of air pollution and traffic volume and capturing variations within each specific area of interest. So this approach involves the selection of 5 to 6 locations per study area. The inclusion of a diverse set of locations is crucial in capturing a wide range of air pollution and traffic volume behaviors. Next, I hope to perform an ANOVA, which is the analysis of variance in each study area. This analysis helps us to determine whether or not significant differences exist between the selected group of locations within a specific area. So as an example, I've included an image sourced from Mural that showcases ANOVA. Please note that this image is solely used for illustrative purposes and does not pertain directly to the current project. So you can see here, each unit is a group, and there's a total of 7 groups in this example. So I'm trying to do something similar and run an ANOVA in each study area and obtain 5 to 6 groups to make sure there are differences between the selected locations. Once the significant differences are established, I will proceed with a k-means cluster analysis. Continue with this example, it's pretty obvious there are at least 2 clusters labeled in red and green. If I were to do something similar like this, this technique will allow me to identify clusters that exhibit similar behaviors in terms of air pollution and traffic volume. So by clustering locations together with similar characteristics, we can look into the underlying pollution patterns and the geographic morphologies. The expected outcomes of the study involves identifying clusters that display similar pollution patterns that can also be correlated with specific geographic morphology. For instance, in extreme cases, lower elevations such as valleys may exhibit higher levels of pollution, while high elevations such as mountains and hills may have different pollution patterns. I'm also looking at coastal regions and urban areas, and these are all very hypothetical, purely speculative, and there's the possibility that there will be no significant patterns at all. So we are looking for clues, but we won't be looking for clues completely random. We will have statistical proofs that certain areas behave the same, and we will evaluate whether geography is the answer. If the time permits, I hope to incorporate the longitudinal effect into my analysis. So longitudinal studies in air pollution research aim to understand the temporal patterns, trends, and variations in air pollution levels over time. So this approach allows us to capture the dynamic nature of air pollution and fluctuations across different time intervals. So for example, the smokes from the forest fires won't go away in the next day, but if we aggregate this data, we lose the longitudinal data, the longitudinal effect. And this is a potential analysis if the time permits, because it comes with its own set of unique challenges. The first challenge is it requires careful data preparation and management. This involves organizing the data at different time points, ensuring consistency throughout the analysis process. The second challenge is there's the need to apply data smoothing techniques such as splining to obtain a more consistent data set. So the data has to be somewhat continuous. And longitudinal analysis poses its own set of unforeseen challenges, including potential data gaps, missing values, or inconsistencies that may arise during the course of the study. Unless we start working on it, we can't foresee the challenges, so it's better to have it as an extension. So finally, here's my project timeline. We are currently here 2023 summer term, and I'm partially into my data collection phase. During the upcoming fall and spring terms, I will continue my study with 3 additional courses. However, I will also be focusing on the data collection and scrutinization at the same time. I aim to select as many suitable areas as I can and finalize the data by the end of April 2024. During the summer of 2024, I will begin my 596B. I will focus mainly on cluster analysis in the first couple of weeks. If the time permits, I will expand upon my existing results and explore the longitudinal effect. Towards the end of the course, I will leave some room for the report write-up. And last but not least, this is the final stage of my MGIS journey. Here, I will present my research and analysis, sharing my findings with everyone. Here are the data sources, and these are the references. Okay, thank you very much for your attention. We have now reached the questions sections. So any questions?
Thank you, Katie. Nicely done. Looks like you've got a question from Beth Day in the chat box.
Okay, so the question is, how will you incorporate the political decisions around road location? The history of why and where a highway road has been located into your analysis. Have you considered incorporating race and ethnicity, historical redlining, and history of placing large highway projects through communities of color? I saw this article on a study by the University of Washington on this topic, and that might be interesting to you. History of why has been located in your analysis. Considered. I'll start with the second question. So have I considered incorporating race? So far, I have not, because I'm only looking at present data, so data that are closer to the current date. So it is interesting if I can incorporate some past historical data into my project through communities of color. Yeah, that's kind of another limitations I haven't thought about. Very, very good point. Thank you so much.
Looks like there is a question also from Fritz Kessler.
Yeah, and yeah, I'm also going to look into this article. Thank you. It's it could be very interesting. So the second question from Dr. Kessler is, great presentation. I may have missed this in your presentation, but could you expand a bit on the geographic extent in your study areas? Your maps showed 2 large and 2 small geographic extents. I wasn't entirely sure the specific locations and geographic extents from which you will collect your data. So the study areas is I began with finding like province locations such as Alberta in the bigger context, and then I will go into this province, look for different groups of data. So to make sure there are differences varied across the entire province, and I will select 5 to 6 different groups of data to expand on my analysis. So so the reason I posted the provinces is because I'm starting with the broader context, and then I will go into the details because the data is not very consistent throughout the entire region, and I will have to sacrifice some locations to account for the data variations. So the eventual study areas will be the little cities or towns that I'm hoping to gather. Oh no, it's definitely not off the topic. It's really interesting point, and points that I haven't thought about. It provides some insights to me as well too.
Other questions for Katie? All right. Well, thanks again, Katie. Best of luck on your project.
Right, thank you.
And that brings us to our third presentation. Brettley Marzen. Brettley, are you set to share with us? Not hearing Brettley.
You can't hear me.
I picked up a little bit there, but it was pretty quiet.
Okay, give me 1 second.
It's getting better.
Okay, how about now?
Sounds pretty good.
Okay, awesome. All right, let me go ahead and present my screen. All right, let me know when you can see the presentation.
Yep, you can see it now.
Awesome. All right, good afternoon, everyone, or as we go into the afternoon. Today, I will be discussing my capstone proposal on the livestock's effect on methane emissions in Kansas. First, a little bit about myself. I'm Brettley Marzen. I'm in the MGIS program. My bachelor's degree was in computational mathematics from Embry-Riddle Aeronautical University. Embry-Riddle is a private aerospace institution in Daytona Beach, Florida. I attended from August 2017 to December 2020. Post-graduation in February 2021, I moved to Wichita, Kansas, where I currently live and work as a quality data analyst for Textron Aviation. This is the company that produces Cessna and Beechcraft airplanes. My day-to-day job typically includes assisting the entire value stream and improving the processes for manufacturing airplanes. When I'm not in my 9-to-5 job, I'm typically at the local rock climbing gym, teaching classes on rock climbing basis, And I also recently started coaching our competition rock climbing team. And a little fun fact down there, I also hope to one day through hike the Pacific Crest Trail. Moving on to the agenda for the presentation, today we'll be speaking about the history and science of cattle in Kansas and methane production, and then we'll move on to the calculations and analysis. Towards the end, we will touch on project timeline, potential conferences to present at, and the anticipated results. Some history on the cattle industry in Kansas. One of the major historic events that largely impacted Kansas agriculture industry was the cattle boom, which was triggered by the Civil War. This caused for a shortage in beef in the United States, and demand for beef was only increasing. Texans were at a loss for how to transport their large cattle population throughout the rest of the country. Therefore, it caused an expansion into the Great Plains. Most of these cattle were transported on cattle trails. The two most popular trails to Kansas are the Western Trail and the Chisholm Trail. These caused for many cow towns to be created in the Great Plains along the trail, and Kansas became an ideal location for cattle farming. The rolling hills and landscape do not allow for productive plant farming, but it is perfectly suitable for cattle to graze on. After the demand of cattle leveled out and the trails became barren, Kansas learned how to keep its agriculture business stable to maintain revenue for the state. This has opened the doors for Kansas to become the #1 exporter of beef in the country, with $1.4 billion of revenue as of 2021. With Kansas containing one of the largest amounts of cattle in the United States, it also faces the challenges of methane production from livestock. One cow can produce anywhere from 154 to 262 pounds of methane a year, according to the Environmental Protection Agency. This is determined by a series of equations that rely on weight, dry matter intake, and emission factors. There are two major ways that cattle produce methane. The first is enteric fermentation. This is a digestive process in ruminant animals like cattle, where microbes produce methane as they decompose food. The methane is mainly exhaled out of the body. The enteric fermentation can vary based on type of feed and any additives in the feed. This is a large portion of methane production in livestock. But the second major way cattle produce methane is through their manure and the management of that manure. So why is methane production from livestock so important? According to the EPA, methane is the second most abundant greenhouse gas in the atmosphere. Greenhouse gases assist in the process of heating up the atmosphere, thus contributing to the concerning issue of global warming. The greenhouse gas methane may appear to be lesser of a concern than the top contender, carbon dioxide, but as it reacts with other elements in the atmosphere, it has the potential to have longer lasting effects. Methane is 80 times more potent at warming than carbon dioxide when you look at a 20-year time span, and it often breaks down into the longer living greenhouse gas at the end of its life cycle. One way this happens is as methane reacts with other elements in the atmosphere, it breaks down into just the carbon dioxide and water, therefore contributing to higher rates of carbon dioxide in the end. And carbon dioxide can live anywhere from 300 to 1,000 years. This is why mitigation for methane is considered so important. Global warming is a hot topic that contributes to become a more concerning issue in the recent years. An increasingly warm planet contributes to issues such as air qualities and natural disasters like wildfires and floods. The Earth's temperature is heating up at a faster rate due to the amount of greenhouse gases that are trapped within our atmosphere. This issue tends to get overlooked due to the fact that it is a long-term issue and does not show immediate effects to generations that feel like it's not their problem to solve since they'll never experience it. This increase in greenhouse gases comes up from a large variety of human-caused activities. As seen in the figure on the screen, The global average temperature is rising significantly over the last decade. With the lifespan of major greenhouse gases, emissions have to be cut significantly to have noticeable effects on the atmosphere. It has been estimated that we need to reduce total carbon emissions by 40% by 2030 to avoid some of the worst effects of it. This is not an individual effort, but an effort that the global community has to contribute to actually achieve results. Targeting large industries such as transportation, electricity, and farming will be the only way to get truly large-scale effects. So for this project, I'll be using enteric fermentation for any methane calculations. When it comes to agriculture and livestock, enteric fermentation makes roughly 39% of the methane emissions. This allows for an opportunity to find ways to mitigate methane production in this area of agriculture since it's quite large. In Kansas, a majority of the full-grown cattle are beef cattle. From a study conducted by Kansas State University, in beef cattle, enteric fermentation accounts for 98% of the methane production. And in dairy cattle, it's still a major producer of methane at 61%. Because of this, the target calculation, this will be the one that I'm focusing on in this project. In addition, the population of cattle in Kansas continues to grow, and in turn, the methane production is going to increase with it. The population of cattle has increased by over 20% from 1990 to 2020, as well as the weight of the average beef cow has increased by over 5%, both of which variables will increase the overall methane production. The goal of this project is going to track the trends of this and the methane productions from the years 1990, 2000, 2010, and 2020 to analyze the trends occurring over these decades in Kansas counties. Research is already being conducted to determine potential solutions to help reduce the methane produced by cattle. One study was conducted to learn how a cattle's diet can affect the methane production from enteric fermentation. The study changed the cattle's diet to consist of red seaweed. By changing just that feed, the enteric fermentation was reduced by up to 98% in some cases. While this is not the most efficient and economically sound way to change a cattle's diet, it is a start to learning what is possible to counteract this issue. Other additives to feed, such as shellfish and oyster, are also being researched to reduce the methane production. In addition, a new type of technology is being developed to mitigate methane on farms and is using biogas to harness chemicals like methane to create energy. This would allow farms to use less external energy and reduce the amount of methane in their farms. In addition, the United States Department of Agriculture has also implemented incentives to encourage farms to pay attention to the topic of methane mitigation. This makes it even more important to understand the state that the livestock industry impacts methane production. It is important to learn about the patterns and trends to develop strategies for this moving forward. Other solutions to reduce methane emissions have also been cultural, as there is more of a push in recent years to eat alternative meat substitutes, such as the Impossible meat and other soy-based protein products. The goal of this project is to study the methane patterns within Kansas to understand the impact that livestock have on greenhouse gas emissions in the atmosphere. This analysis would track how the increase in cattle population and increase in the weight of the average cattle impact output of methane. This analysis will provide a historic understanding of previous decades of methane emissions and learn the current state of methane emissions today. This will allow us to be able to track trends and predict what future conditions will look like if no mitigation methods are implemented. Then a GIS analysis will be performed to identify further trends that find correlations within the variables and patterns in the counties involving methane output, cattle types, and population, and incorporate temperature to identify any common trends that link the county conditions together. The objective of the geospatial analysis is to identify groups of counties that are undergoing similar conditions to have the ability to implement strategies to assist the mitigation of multiple counties across Kansas all at once and provide a baseline for how to improve and where to start mitigation tactics. Moving on into our data and methods, there are a variety of data sources that are used for this project. The first data set is going to be from the National Agricultural Statistics Service, or NASS, which will be the cattle population data, which is separated by cattle type. This data provides beef cattle, dairy cattle, calves, and cattle on feed, which will be all of the cattle type used for this analysis. I will gather the information for the average body weight for each cattle from the Environmental Protection Agency. The body weights will be used in the dry matter intake calculations, which are used for the methane calculation. Fat-corrected milk will also be collected from NASS for the dry matter intake calculation for dairy cows. And then lastly, temperature data for Kansas counties will be collected from the National Oceanic Atmospheric Administration to contribute for the GIS analysis portion. Here's an example of the cattle data for 2021 and a study area of all the Kansas counties. There's roughly 105. This is just a count of all the cattle types for each county. The analysis I will be doing will break up each type of cattle to respectively calculate that cattle's specific enteric fermentation, methane production. You can see where currently some of the bigger counties with cattle reside, which do line up with a lot of the historic cattle trails. The dry matter intake is an important calculation that is needed to find methane production. This measure is estimated feed that an animal will need to maintain its weight. It is different for each animal type, as you can see listed on the screen, and will be calculated respectively. The biggest item to note in these calculations is that the body weight is shrunken body weight, which is 96% of the body weight, and this is to account for the animal's weight excluding its last meal. In addition, the net energy in the equation, or the NE in the equations there stand for net energy for the maintenance of the animal, which is calculated with the average body weight and is used to determine the amount of energy that that cattle needs to stay at the current consistent weight. And this also varies from type of cow. The methane calculations for the project is as shown, where dry matter intake will be calculated from the equations on the previous screen. These are gathered from the nutrient requirements for cattle reports that is written by the Board of Agriculture's National Research Council. And then some other data and the equations are collected from the Intergovernmental Panel on Climate Change Guidelines and the Environmental Protection Agency's inventory of US greenhouse gas emissions. These sources provide the equations and data for methane emission factors and the methane emissions for each type of cattle. For the methane calculations, a measure of uncertainty needs to be calculated to understand how reliable the results are. The uncertainty bounds will be calculated using a Gaussian distribution to create a two-sided interval, and this will provide insights into the limitations of the research in the future. These uncertainty bounds will be needed to evaluate the methane emission calculations for each type of cattle. Following the methane calculations, a GIS analysis will be performed. This will be done using a multivariate clustering tool within ArcGIS. Multivariate cluster analysis is a type of unsupervised machine learning which evaluates patterns within the data variables provided. By identifying patterns within the counties of Kansas, it will allow us the ability to understand where to implement resources for mitigation first. Multivariate clustering uses a k-means algorithm to group data together. This is a process where a number of clusters are chosen as an initial seed and selected at random to be the center of a cluster. And then using the sum of squares, this will be calculated to make the new, better center position for those clusters, and the cycle continues to determine the best partitions of the variable based on the sum of squares and all the variables selected in the analysis. An example of cluster data is shown on the screen based on where in this case, the position of all of those data points, the k-means cluster has grouped them together, as you can see on the right. One challenge to using unsupervised machine learning is that the program can calculate the proper patterns for you, but you still need to be able to interpret the results. An example of this is I can feed data into a program that has to do with sports. The algorithm will process the data and divide it into categories that are related to each other, but I will still have to go through and read those results to understand that the first group is identified as baseball, the second group is identified as soccer, and the last group was identified as basketball. In ArcGIS, there's an option to run clustering analysis to find an optimized number of clusters in the data set. So for this one, it mostly would have found 3 in the data set. For this example, this option is going to be used initially in ArcGIS, but in some cases, the clustering analysis can have too many clusters that it's really hard to identify the trends within, like 20 plus. It's really hard to find all the different variances within the data. So if that is the case, it will be reduced to make analyzing the patterns a little bit easier. The output of the tool in ArcGIS is 2 different types of box plot graphs. Box plots are extremely helpful when analyzing data to understand where a majority of the data lies and where your outliers are. This can help interpret the results of the relationships between variables and understand if the data is skewed in any way. These plots will allow me to interpret the relationships within the data to determine how these conditions are similar. Both of these graphs allow us to see the variation within the groups. The plot on the left shows the variation in averages and the wide range of all data variables within that group. And the right will show the variations with each individual variable within the groups. Project timeline. The timeline for this project is pretty long with plenty of wiggle room to overcome any unplanned issues that may arise. The timeline is split into 4 sections that will need to be completed after this research class. The first big task to accomplish is the methane calculations for all the Kansas counties. The only current blocker I have for that portion is I'm waiting to receive the updated nutrient requirement books from Interlibrary Loan, but I should be getting them within the next week. They'll have the updated equations for the methane emissions to ensure the analysis will be up to date with current research. During this time, I will also be finishing formatting all the data I need to use in ArcGIS for the methane calculations. I've allotted about 2.5 months for this first section. Next, I will perform the confidence intervals on those methane calculations and then move forward into the GIS analysis to find the trends in the data. All of that will be aimed to be completed by the end of this year and early next year. I assume one of the longer sections of this analysis will be optimizing the clustering model to output the best groups. Following the completion of the analysis, I'll begin my research paper. With this timeline, it should allow me to take the next capstone class in the spring of 2024 to finish compiling, writing, and editing the completed research. And at the end of that class, I should be preparing to present at a conference. So possible presentation presentation venues. The first one up there that I'm hoping to present at is in the spring of 2024, the American Association for Advancement of Science. This conference features all graduate and undergraduate research and is a poster presentation style conference. This conference is held in Denver, Colorado, and an abstract will need to be submitted by early October. This conference is a little earlier than my intended completion date for the project. So the last 2 will be the ones that align more with it if I can't complete my research a little bit ahead of schedule. And that includes the American Association of Geographers annual meeting, also located in Denver, Colorado, and the Pennsylvania GIS conference in State College. Lastly, we move into the anticipated results. In this analysis, I expect to see really high methane calculations within counties that fall along that historic cattle trail. In addition, due to the rise in cattle population and rise in weight of certain types of cattle, I expect to see more exponential growth in methane throughout the decades instead of a linear pattern. As far as the geospatial analysis goes, I'm hoping to have groups of about 3 to 5 to analyze and look at the ratios of methane and cattle types, and expecting to see increasing temperatures in those counties as well. Although temperature may not have increased due to other external factors, this will still provide us a good idea of if these items may be related. This will provide insights into future paths to contribute to methane mitigation efforts based on the conditions for each grouping of counties. Other items that may have to be evaluated are how the cattle populations fluctuate over time with each cattle type. Larger populations of calves and cattle on feed could develop into higher numbers of beef and dairy cows later down the line. This could assist in any decisions made around how to mitigate methane emissions for different types of cattle. And that concludes my proposal presentation. And I'm ready to answer any questions if anyone has any.
Okay, thank you, Brettley. Questions for Brettley? Nice job.
Thank you.
I guess I'll go first. I think you said that livestock population in Kansas has been increasing over the time frame that you're looking at.
Yep.
And I think you made a kind of a generic prediction that what you're going to find is that the methane has increased to go along with that. Are you able to quantify yet at this point to what extent you expect the methane production to have increased? Does that remain to be seen?
Yeah, unfortunately, I think that's just going to come with the actual methane calculations. I think I noted that there's been at least a 20% increase in the cattle population, but the weight has also increased for the average cattle in at least beef cows, which is what Kansas mostly is. And with those two factors, I'm not quite sure how that ratio looks at affecting the total methane calculations, because there's like 3 different levels of calculations that go to that final methane calculation.
Right.
Yeah, so unfortunately, no, not yet.
Right, makes sense. Looks like you've got a question from Fritz in the chat box.
Yeah, the question is, could your method also be applied to pig and poultry farming operations? If so, then what variation would you have to apply? Yeah, I don't think it would be too hard to add that in. I think NAS also has all the statistics for the population, but I would have to go into further detail with what the dry matter intake and what other factors go into those specific type of livestock. So I think it could definitely add a better layer to the analysis, but I think it would probably take an equivalent amount of time to what it would take just to do cattle to also incorporate pig and poultry. Another question, would there be another source of methane in the areas that could throw off your calculations? I think it could be possible in some of the counties that have the bigger cities. Over on the east side of Kansas, the 3 big cities are Wichita, Topeka, and then Kansas City, Kansas. So I think in those areas, the actual methane emission, if you were looking at the statistics that like the EPA would put out from like actually measuring how much methane is in the air, could throw off the calculation. But I think since I'm just looking at factors that relate to cattle for these methane predictions, I don't think you'll see any like skew in the data from my side. If that answers that question. All right. I was looking at trying to get numbers from the EPA on like the methane, the like actual methane readings from the different counties, but they only measure it in a handful of counties throughout the state. So it wasn't really anything worth pursuing, looking at what the estimated contribution to the overall methane in Kansas is just from cattle.
Other questions for Brettley? I just have one comment. I think you talked about looking at temperature data and trying to see if there's correlations between, where livestock methane production has increased, whether there's a correlation with temperatures in that area. I think greenhouse gases like methane, the mixing from transport by winds, I think those gases get well mixed through the global atmosphere. So I don't know that you're going to find that kind of specific correlation. It would certainly contribute to a global climate change, but I don't know that you would find it, right in that local area. So, but I think certainly you're looking at the changes in methane production over the time period will be a useful contribution to the literature. So I think that's good. The other thing I would suggest is maybe look for a climate conference to present this at. I would think that audience would be very interested in hearing what you have to say.
Yeah, I was struggling to find conferences a bit because of looking at the spring 2024 timeline. It was hard to find anything that had dates. So I'll continue to look for conferences for sure, but those were the ones that I could find that had dates.
Okay, good.
Thank you very much.
So I just posted the link to the peer review form again. Just a reminder to everyone to please provide some feedback to our speakers. And that takes us to the next presenter, Wesley. Wesley, please make sure that I'm pronouncing your last name correctly. Is it McCush or McCush?
McCush, yeah, that's right. I think you've been the first person who's ever gotten it right on the first try.
Well, that's good. All right. Yeah, so Wesley's going to talk to us about policing tactics using geospatial data and analysis. So please take it away.
Awesome. All right, we're able to see the screen well.
Yes, I can see your PowerPoint.
Fantastic. All right, so I'm Wesley McCush. The project is intelligence-led policing patrols. It's a geospatial approach to providing evidence-based policing tactics to the patrol routes. Some of the background, I got interested into a lot of crime data and crime solutions through my undergrad. I studied intelligence. However, there was a large concentration on the criminal intelligence. So I got to dig into things like crime theory and plotting a lot of that how and where and why associated with crime. At the same time, I was also working closely with Department of State and their diplomatic security agents as an embassy guard. So I got exposure to a lot of the federal law enforcement training and different things that they would run into in some of their different procedures. Professionally, I'm an imagery analyst in the Marine Corps, so I'm already heavily exposed to a lot of the geospatial intelligence background. However, I just did a deployment out to UCOM where I was building a lot of quick web applications, grabbing reference material, putting it into an easily digestible medium. That way it could go back and be referenced quickly. And that was what I really wanted to look at, but from a policing standpoint. Having taken all of that into consideration, I tried to identify a few areas that law enforcement continually ends up having to push back against. The biggest thing being your community transparency. You get all these officers and they've spent so much time in their field and they just know. They know where they need to be. They know what they need to do, but that's not easily understandable to the common person. So that was one of my targeted things, is how can I relay their experience and their decisions to the community? Next, I want to be able to provide that decision-making based on historic data. That's where these police officers are deriving their decisions. And that's what I want to be able to present and show that correlation. And all of that ties into alleviating bias through their evidence-based decisions. Looking at those issues, the solution I came up with was developing a tool that leverages historic analysis to provide patrol solutions that's accessible by the public, but allows that information to be used with the patrol officers' expertise. And this kind of boils down to a web-based application that performs a route development based on hotspot analysis to connect all these high-density crime areas. For the area that I want to work in, I currently live in Fredericksburg, Virginia, and I figured the best way to develop this project, have user input, and be able to present this is in the area that I live. So I'm going to look at Fredericksburg, Virginia. It's located about in the middle between DC and Richmond. It only covers a 10.5 square mile area, and it's got about 28,000 people. This area on the map that's displayed, it's not broken up into the police department's patrolling areas. However, there are 4 areas that closely resemble these wards within the area. In developing my goals and objectives, I almost just took the problems that I saw in the general field and made those that goal. So my transparency for the police force. In developing this project and this tool, I want the community to be able to access it as well. This is not going to be something that's just hidden behind an organization and only their systems and tools can access. This will be available on ArcGIS Online, so where anyone can go plug in their parameters, look at that underlying crime data, and see why the police are in that area. The next goal, we're looking at the next step of a hotspot analysis. There's a plethora of ways that hotspots and densities are being done, and those are great, but they don't give an answer at the lowest level. These are great for policymakers, it's great for supervisors, but your individual person, your individual officer isn't able to action those. So taking it to the next step, putting a route to those hotspots is one of my goals. Lastly, while I'm developing this tool for the Fredericksburg Police Department, I'm going to be documenting all the steps, almost building out a how do I create this for my own people methodology. That way it can be a plug and play tool. Yes, you'll have to import your own data in your own areas, tweak some of the parameters, but you'll be able to take this tool and implement it anywhere else. For the methodology, this is kind of a twofold project. First is going to be setting it up on the ArcPro environment. So with that, the first step is going to be importing the crime data, our patrol zones, the actual jurisdiction of the city, and then seeing how many officers are patrolling per day. I've already been in communication with an officer, Greg Barr of the Fredericksburg Police Department. And from him, he said there's at best one, maybe a second officer that's patrolling the 4 zones of the city. However, typically it's just the one person alone and unafraid going through his zone. The next step is creating a tessellation within these zones. This is done to have an equal area to perform that hotspot analysis. Next step, we're going to bring in that hotspot analysis, and we want to identify the different high density crime areas. In this step, what I want to do is flesh out each of the top crime points. So things like your larcenies, your burglaries, put those out as the parenting thing. That way we're not in the overall idea. Lastly, is be able to create routes with our stops at each hotspot within that tessellation unique to each zone. That's our first step in that ArcPro environment. The second step is migrating our ArcPro workspace into something that can be easily accessible in Arc Online. So first step is going to be developing and conditioning that data within the ArcPro environment. Next step is going to be creating this routing tool. This is likely going to involve connecting a handful of geoprocessing steps within Model Builder and then exporting that out into a toolbox and into a widget so that it can be used within that application. The third step, making sure this all works easily in the ArcPro environment, which is the bare minimum that I want to get to. The next step is moving that map and the toolbox into the online suite, and then converting all of that into a web application that can be accessed both by your individual patrol officer and the community equally. For the overall project timeline, I broke it off into months between now and when I plan on concluding 596B. So August is just going to be our data acquisition and map formatting. I did put a large window on this to acquire the data because Fredericksburg's open data initiative for their GIS stuff isn't the most easy to navigate. They've got a lot of red tape associated with some police components, so I might have to do a FOIA, which is your Freedom of Information Act request to access these. If I'm not able to get that, what they do is they push out a PDF document of the crime. So I have to go hand jam all of those into a table to be able to import it into a GIS. Next for September is we're going to actually be creating this tool and the map associated with it. I plan to migrate all of that into Arc Online, and this is also going to include that transfer of that geoprocessing for the routing into that web map. Also within that October timeframe is when I'm going to have Officer Greg Barr from the police department kind of provide some user input and kind of give me a hands-on overlook. He used to be a GIS practitioner for the city, and he's been one of my best touch points in communicating what my objectives are to the police department. November, I'm going to continue to refine it, take Officer Barr's input, and make this as user-friendly and as accessible as possible. December will be the presentation of this tool and also the conclusion of 596B for me. For that presentation, since I'm building this tool very custom tailored to the Fredericksburg Police Department, they are the most ideal people that I want to deliver this to. When I communicated this to Officer Barr, he suggested that the best time for me to do that would be during the roll call and shift change between the officers. So I would get both the evening shift and the daytime shift and be able to present this tool to them. For that overall presentation structure, since it's not a big conference, what that is going to entail is giving a quick summary background and the purpose of this tool, demonstrate the tool, having their input, such as suggesting that an officer give me which zone he's given, which crime he's looking at, and what time he would want to look at, and then generate a route based on that. Finally is going to be the Q&A period between me and those officers at that roll call. That way I can get their input on how this tool should be refined. Lastly, for my anticipated results, at the bare minimum, like I stated earlier, I want that ArcPro workspace to be able to create this route. What this would do as a minimum result is allow a supervisor or a headquarter element to create these routes and disseminate them widely to all the patrol officers. Again, this is the minimum desired result because what I would prefer is that web-based application that can be accessed by the patrol officer on their personal computers and make their own routes based on what they want to go look at. Now, this is going to allow the officer to create a route at any point during their patrol and customize it based on their uniquely desired but limited parameters. And I think that will sum up my presentation if there's any questions.
All right, thank you, Wesley. Good job. I'll go first with questions. You mentioned one of your challenges being getting your hands on the crime data from the city. And I think you said that the data is in the form of PDF files. And so you're having to go through and basically retype the data. I was wondering if you had looked into whether it'd be possible to automate the conversion of the PDF data into a more usable format. I don't know whether that's even possible, but it came to mind.
So without giving off too much, one of the things I had done in UCOM on that deployment is we had people from NGA who developed a tool that could read that unstructured data set and it would transpose it into a table that was easily digestible. Off the top of my head, can I replicate it right now? That would take a little bit of research and personal development to get to. Ideally, that is the least desired course of action to develop out this data set. It's doable, and that's why I kind of gave myself that about a month just to acquire all of this data. I did submit my Freedom of Information Act to the police department, and I'm just awaiting to see what their final decision is on what they want to release. Does that kind of answer your question?
Yeah, it does. I suppose a lot depends on exactly how much work it's going to be to enter it manually, and how much work it would be to develop a script to do it. But looks like you've got a couple of questions in the chat box.
Right. So the first one's from Elizabeth Day. How will your model account for changes in hotspots over time? Will there be a time variable? So what I'm going to look at is crime over a year. That should give me a large swath of information. However, it's going to depend on how the officer wants to run this tool. How I have it desired to be set up is the officer can go pick his time period, whether a week, the last month, a quarter, or the full year's data set. And then he'll go pick the crime that he wants to look at, whether it's larceny, burglary, drug-related misdemeanors, and it will generate that hotspot. It will just go and retrieve that information. So I'm not so much looking at the changes in hotspots over time. Unfortunately, I haven't found a REST service that brings in the live data. However, it is on my list of things to do to go communicate with the IT department that if you have this database, how hard would your crime database be to make this live data and make that into a REST server? Does that kind of answer your question, Elizabeth? We'll just go ahead and move on to Mark's. Yes. So Elizabeth said it does. I'm used to more open data we have in Seattle. I understand. So what I've done for the past couple of classes I've done at Penn State is looked at the Washington, D.C. data set. So I've gotten really familiar with it. All of their crime data is open sourced. So it's really easy to access and do all these different processes that are going to go into this tool. It's just using this unique Fredericksburg data set and then whatever issues that may come up from their sharing. Mark's question is, would the route be configurable based on the type of crime or required type of police response to account for different focus areas driven by dynamic real-world events? For example, home burglary focused during Christmas season, vandalism following major sporting events. Yep, and I saw that you said I already answered your question, but just to re-hit it, those predefined parameters that I want to establish within this tool is a general time period and then that crime parent subtype. So I don't want to get too granular because some of their things get really deep into what facet of crime was committed. But I think keeping it very high level, such as larceny, burglary, sexual-based assaults, or sexual-based crimes rather, you leave yourself open to all those different options. So I hope that answers your question, Mark.
Any other questions for Wesley? All right, well, nice job, Wesley. Best of luck on your project. And I'd be curious to see, I hope you do end up, making a presentation during roll call, and hopefully the officers there will have a tool that they can use to help them in their work.
Well, thank you, James. So I did want to preface, I don't think I hit it on my brief. At no point is this tool supposed to replace the patrol officer's intuition. They will always know best. They're doing it. Officer Bauer has been in the same zone for 4 years. He knows that area way more than I do, even though I've lived here for the same amount of time. This is just going to be complementary and providing the why they're there to the public.
Okay, yeah, very good, very good.
Thank you.
All right, that brings us to our last presentation for today, Mark Rednauer. Mark is actually wrapping up his capstone work and needed a presentation venue, so that's what we're giving him here. Mark, are you able to share your screen with us? Are you there, Mark? I know you you just asked a question in the chat. Looks like Mark logged off. He's probably trying to log off and log back in.
Hey, is everyone able to hear me? This is Mark.
Yes, I can hear you, Mark.
Okay, as you introduced my topic, my power went out here. We're having a huge storm and I lost Wi-Fi momentarily. I'm back on now.
Okay. Well, hopefully you're able to get this in before it goes out again. I can see your slides, so take it away.
All right. And am I full screen?
Not yet. I'm seeing your whole PowerPoint window here.
Okay. All right. Yeah. So I'm very thankful for the opportunity to do my 596B presentation here. Super appreciative of the flexibility from the school to allow me to do this due to just military and family events that have occurred. So thank you so much. The topic is augmented reality as a geospatial enabler for intelligence, surveillance, and reconnaissance. And my advisor is Dr. Kessler. What I'll talk about is a brief introduction. I do lean on my own expertise significantly, as opposed to, it's less of a specific data focus than a lot of the other presentations have been, and I'll explain that. I will talk about minimum performance expectations for my ideal implementation, and then we'll talk about ideal mixed reality applications, the implementation, and a conclusion. So why am I qualified to talk about this? I'm an Air Force pilot, 8 years of service, commissioned as an officer in 2015. I am an instructor and evaluator pilot for the MQ-9 Reaper, which you may recognize as the large unmanned aerial vehicle UAV. In the Air Force, we call it remotely piloted aircraft, or RPA. more than 2,500 flight hours and approaching 500 instruction hours. And the chief evaluator pilot for a 200-member unit. Also one of 4 lead evaluators for Air Force Special Operations Command. I have a marketing degree that has nothing to do with any of this. And I did complete a post-baccalaureate on the way to this MGIS in geospatial intelligence applications, also from Penn State. Some background. Information as a military concept, one of the 7 joint functions of warfare prescribed by the U.S. Joint Chiefs of Staff, deliberately integrating with other joint functions to change or maintain perceptions, attitudes, and other elements that may drive desired behaviors and to support human and automated decision-making. So what I'm presenting is information as a force multiplier. What I mean when I say force multiplier, if you don't have a military background, is really just a synthesis, basically just the results of 2 things is greater than the 2, the sum is greater than the 2 parts individually. Military information is primarily gained through intelligence. And so you have data on one side, and actionable intelligence is something completely different, as I'm sure Wesley understands as an intel analyst. So it's a balance of acquiring useful organization and disseminating it with access to and massing of information. And that's why we see such a movement towards machine learning and AI as a means of filling the gaps that our human intel analysts can't fill just because of the sheer mountain of data that we're currently producing. So what I'll talk about is how mixed reality can help us solve some of those problems. And just if you were entirely uninitiated with the spectrum of mixed reality, and it is a spectrum, this slide just kind of explains that. On the far left, you've got reality as we know it. On the far right, you've got VR. But then somewhere in between, you've got augmented reality, which is a physical environment with some virtual interaction. That's what I'll be spending my time talking about. And then augmented virtuality, less talked about, which is a virtual environment with some physical interaction. And you might consider that to be like an Oculus headset. So my purpose is to utilize mixed reality to increase ISR aircrew situational awareness. And again, ISR is intelligence, surveillance, and reconnaissance, to decrease ISR aircrew peripheral distractions and to improve ISR aircrew reaction over time. I will discuss really from an MQ-9 perspective. Generally, most of these concepts, I believe, are applicable to ISR in general. There are several reasons why I've chose to focus on MQ-9, not the least of which is my experience and expertise. But as a case study, we'll look at the MQ-9. It's been in the U.S. inventory since 2007, highly sought after by U.S. Air Force ground commanders, mostly because of its capabilities, but also because of its impressive loiter time. So because the airplane is basically a glider with an engine slapped on, it can loiter over a target for more than 15 hours easily, which is just massive collection potential that can't really be obtained through any other type of manned aircraft currently. Because the MQ-9 flies through full motion video, and because I'm not in the airplane flying it, it makes it an especially appetizing test subject for augmented reality. And that's just because applying augmented reality to video is a much more already explored venue than using like a heads-up display in front of a manned pilot, like you might see if you've looked at the helmet of an F-35. Maybe you've seen news articles about the challenges of overlaying augmented reality over your actual vision. The MQ-9 is able to mitigate a lot of that by applying augmented reality instead over video, which the technology easily exists to do. Also, robust reach back capability. What I mean by that is the MQ-9's, because it's not the airplane is deployed, but the crew is not. And that means that the crew has significant access to information, GIS on multiple different classifications, always being input, and all that information. I'm sorry, I may be being evacuated from the building. Okay, I'm okay. So the robust reach back capability means that there's a lot of geospatial information that can be applied, more so than an airplane where the crew is in the air might have access to. And that goes along with the complex link and network architecture. And then, of course, the MQ-9 is a classic example of sensory deprivation typical of remotely piloted aircraft. I don't feel anything when I fly that airplane. I don't tilt to the right when I turn to the right. I don't feel bumps when I fly through rough air. And so augmented reality can really help to fill some of those gaps that are missing, that would allow better pilotage for unmanned aircrew. And just so that you have an understanding of what it looks like in the cockpit, in quotes, this is the ground control station where MQ-9s are flown. Critical safety navigation and tactical information is spread throughout multiple visual channels, drawing attention away from the central tracker display and the heads-up display. And those last two that I'm referring to are the top screen on either control station you're looking at there with the yellow map, and the heads-up display there is the screen just below it. You'll see that the left seat, which is the pilot, is looking through his nose cam, which is a always forward-facing camera. And you'll see that on the right, the sensor operator, who's responsible for controlling the cameras, is looking at the ground. These two actions can happen simultaneously, and either crew member can look at either camera. But what we're seeing here is a pilot trying to observe what's going on in the air around the airplane, and the sensor operator is trying to observe probably the target on the ground via the moving multispectral camera. Every other screen that's not those provides peripheral information that can be modified as needed for each mission. But regardless, any of the screens that are not in that central stack for either crew member are not required for flight of the airplane, and require diverting attention from actually flying the airplane safely and effectively accomplishing the mission that's on the screen. This is the heads-up display in more detail, which is that screen just below the moving map tracker display. This gives you an idea of kind of the information that currently is being presented to the aircrew. Now, this is configurable. Not all of this information has to be displayed all the time, but you'll notice that the white graphics seem to underlie the green graphics. That's because those are burnt in, as we say, to the camera image. Those are not configurable necessarily as easily to the crew in the seat as the green data, which is fully customizable to turn on or off or change even the units of measurement. So talking about ISR aircrew with the MQ-9 as my case study, what are the minimum performance expectations geospatially that we expect the crew to have mastery of? It really comes down to three categories: geospatial self-awareness, geospatial target awareness, and navigational awareness. I consider these three types of really geospatial mastery to be critical for the aircrew to understand where they are, where they're going, and how they're going to get there. So geospatial self-awareness, we're talking about other airplanes. We're talking about boundaries, such as national borders. We're talking about threats to the airplane that would impact where your airplane currently is. Geospatial target awareness, we're talking about geospatial considerations for the target in play, or what your mission is. And primarily that's going to be collateral concerns and historic points of interest that would be applicable to understanding the context surrounding your target. And of course, navigational awareness, airfields, routing. How do I safely get this airplane from where I took off to go accomplish a mission and take it back to where I land? You'll see as I go through some of these categories that my project is a high-level conceptual framework that's is less data focused, and there are obstacles that I'll talk about that have contributed to that. A lot of it has to do with classification, and even more has to do with even the data that I have appropriate clearance to access, I certainly can't present in this venue. And so what this really plays out as is a conceptual framework that could be presented to stakeholders who would be military industrial complex decision makers. And that's my other obstacle really, is the military industrial complex and the proprietary information that belongs to contract companies, and trying to make it all talk to each other on one central control display. And I'll talk further on that. So geospatial self-awareness, talking about other aircraft, and you can further break that down into friendly, neutral, unknown, and hostile airplanes. That's an example of just kind of generally what the data looks like when it's not augmented, when it's not displayed through augmented reality. This is not unlike what an ISR aircrew might see, with different colors displaying, different different categories of airplane or different allegiances. Boundaries, we're talking about either airspace boundaries or geopolitical boundaries. Provinces, nations, and special use airspace might look like this. It's three-dimensional, so it'll have lateral boundaries as well as altitude ceilings and floors. And we're talking about threats, surface-to-air weapons, weather and terrain being the primary threats, surface-to-air weapons, and then weather always a threat to airplanes, especially airplanes with little defense against icing or turbulence, which is the case for the MQ-9. And then, of course, terrain. Controlled flight and terrain is the source of approximately 70% of the incidents that we see in the military, so a huge concern. And then geospatial target awareness. We're talking about collateral concerns such as schools, medical facilities, civilian infrastructure, and that includes in current missions that are primarily counterterrorism. We're talking a lot about mosques and friendly force locations. Historic points of interest, we're talking about pattern of life data, other targets, vehicles, buildings of interest, things that build out the context for a target and why we care about it. It's pattern of life data, type of analysis, and other compounds or targets might be of interest in, of course, vehicles. Navigational awareness. We're talking about friendly, neutral, and hostile airfields. Very important to understand the delineation between those for the ISR aircrew. And we're talking about routing, airspace corridors, routes, navigational waypoints, the safe way that we have to get an airplane from point A to point B without worrying about other traffic or even host nation traffic regulations or host nations attempting to defend against an airplane when they don't understand where it's going or why. Those types of maps look like this. So how do we take all of that data and apply it in a mixed reality application? I propose that the heads-up display, which is centrally located and it is kind of always the center of a hub and spoke cross-check when aircrew are constantly, looking at their peripheral displays. They're always trained to come back to the HUD, so it's centrally located. I propose that that should be seamlessly integrated with the data from the peripheral displays through augmented reality. It would be a harmonious data relationship, which would require some relationships, would require data relationships, having a backend relationship that allows units and formatting to kind of come together from disparate data sources. Mixed classifications should be viewable on one monitor cleared at the highest level, and that can be the case. That is a doable scenario specifically for the heads-up display, which is another reason why I choose the HUD. And then a fully customizable layer display configurable for different phases of flight. The information that the aircrew cares about during takeoff or landing might be different than the information they care about in transit, and that's going to be different from information they care about when actually prosecuting a target. And so I propose that all of this data be augmented onto the HUD. This is a data map viewed through classification of what all the information has to, how all the information will arrive at the HUD. And keeping this unclassified, I won't talk about which classifications the colors represent, but understand that the yellow, purple, and red are 3 different types of classifications of information currently available to the aircrew in flight. And the yellow classification A is the highest amount of classification. Therefore, since that classification is currently present on the HUD, inherently it is able to support data from any lower classification. The light blue screens are screens that are direct input output screens. They're not providing supplemental information from other sources, and so they're not really included in the mixed reality application I'm speaking of. So we talk about aircraft. Frequently known data on aircraft that is available to the aircrew through different means is the entity's heading, speed, altitude, call sign, sometimes national affiliation. The recommended AR overlay for this, based on my experience and based on looking at just what has traditionally worked in 2D maps through my literature review and applying that for ease of recognition in the first phase of augmented reality application. So friendly entities are typically blue. So I would recommend a tracer square with a blue outline and no fill. For neutral, I would recommend yellow, and for that should say hostile, I would recommend red. Available there, you can see in this mock-up, you'd have heading, not true airspeed, altitude, call sign, and affiliation. That information would be one of the configurable pieces, where depending on how much an ISR aircrew wants to convolute their screen or how clean they need it to look for whatever their phase of mission is, that would be configurable to give them as much or as little data as they require. This information typically involves, right now, the aircrew turning their attention to one of 2 other screens providing some data on known air tracks. And you can understand the danger when flying in close proximity to another airplane to take your attention away to figure out what that airplane is doing. It's a lot harder than when a pilot is in the cockpit looking out the window of an airplane. Talking about boundaries, frequently known data here. Lat-long coordinates for vertices and vectors of boundaries and the dimensions and details of airspace containers. This information rarely changes, especially when we're talking about national and provincial borders. So my recommendation for an AR overlay here, black polyline for national borders, in keeping with most 2D maps that aircrew are familiar with observing, to include aviation maps, and gray polyline for provincial and regional borders. For special use airspace, I would recommend a black translucent rectangular prism for assigned working airspace, that is the airspace that aircraft controllers in your region understand you to be working in for safety, and red translucent cylinders for restricted operating zones. Restricted operating zones, otherwise known as a ROZ, those would be containers of airspace that have been deconflicted for actual release of weapons. And so very important to get that information in front of the eyes of the aircrew for the safety of everyone on the ground and other airplanes. This is also something that requires the aircrew to turn their attention to another screen currently to observe whether they are flying inside of or outside of a restricted operating zone. Threats. Frequently known data is surface radar emission locations and likely engagement range, terrain height and coordinates, and lightning and cloud data. So my recommendation for AR overlay, on the picture on the left, you'll see surface to air weapons. I'd recommend a red triangle at the central location of the radar emission. with no fill at the threat center, and then appropriate size red threat rings surrounding, and that would be indicative of the known range of that system, which at some classification level is typically known. The middle picture indicates the way I would recommend that we augment terrain with solid blue points with accompanying maximum elevation figure labels. This comes from existing aviation charts. The data is known. It does not change until a new publication of that aviation mapping product is produced. And so this is fairly static data that could easily be augmented onto the HUD. That currently is not. This tells the aircrew how low they can safely fly over any given piece of land. And then weather, it's obviously a very simple mock-up on the right picture, but solid yellow lightning bolt icons for recent lightning strikes. The Air Force has very strict regulations about how close Air Force airplanes can fly to known lightning strikes. And so plotting historic strike locations can really help aircrew plot the movement of a storm system. That is more information that's currently available, but requires a lot of mouse clicks and a lot of turning attention away from possibly observing the cloud system as it builds. Collateral concerns. We frequently know the locations of schools, medical facilities, civic centers, and friendly troop locations. So I'd recommend for AR overlays, this is really kind of just simple Google Maps type icons, and that information usually through OpenStreetMap in regions where Google Maps doesn't have data. I'd recommend simple black pin icon of a grad cap for schools, a cross for medical facilities, a courthouse for civil infrastructure, and then to delineate friendly troop locations, a blue star. Now, this would help to prevent the amount of attention that needs to be devoted to ensure prevention of fratricide currently. When we talk about geospatial target awareness, we're talking about also historic points of interest. This would be polyline data mostly for pattern of life. So solid green polyline for known routes, solid green polygon for known stops. For other targets, so targets that are not your current target, but might be of interest, 50% transparent green polyline and 50% transparent green polygons for known stops. In vehicles of interest, dashed gray polygon tracking the vehicle. That assumes mature machine learning. This technology exists and is being used by Air Force assets, and it's not perfect, but assuming the mature machine learning, we should be able to feed the algorithm a description of the vehicle, and we could get this type of overlay when the machine learning recognizes it. And airfields could look like this. We almost always know airfield location, runway data, national affiliation of the operator, and fuel available. So AR overlays could look like these types of pins, using the same type of color description for aircraft: blue for friendly, yellow for neutral, and red for hostile. For routing, this is a little trickier because it's generally it's tied to lateral locations on the ground, but the overlays exist in the air, which will have challenges to produce on a 2D video screen. But it might look something like this. We know location, altitude, and dimensions of air corridors and routes, and we know precise GPS waypoints. So I would recommend augmented reality airspace corridors and routes involve purple translucent rectangular prisms, and that's in keeping with existing aviation mapping products, and navigational waypoints represented by green crosses. Implementation. As mentioned, there are a lot of classification errors that have prevented me from actually exercising what I'm proposing here. But cross-classification barriers, my assumption is that those can be overcome when enough colonels and generals sign enough papers, and proprietary aircraft manufacturer software becomes permissive either through the allowance of open architecture for augmented reality overlay, or through, I should say, deliberate collaboration with the combined goal of accomplishing missions more safely and effectively. So if approval could be obtained and those obstacles could be overcome, then the right way to implement this would be through a human-centered design study with 3 phases, implementing an IRB that would allow RPA aircrew, both pilot and sensor operator, to identify and quantify the situational awareness and reaction time issues with the HUD presentation. After that initial IRB, wherein the aircrew members would be shown different variants of augmented reality overlays, the information of their response time and how quickly they were able to recognize what the augmented reality overlay attempts to show them, wireframe mock-ups would be completed, and then a final follow-up IRB survey would allow the refined data to be presented so that we could quantify the improvement in reaction time and recognition. My estimated timeline and cost looks something like this. The timeline in the military is entirely impossible to nail down, but I know that the IRB creation and implementation would take about 2 months, with probably a cost of about $5,000 to the military. Wireframe mock-up generation, based on current cost of designer hourly fees, 1.5 months, $12,000. IRB follow-up and full review, another month and another $5,000. The data aggregation, security and routing, based on conversations with some data security engineers who might be cleared to work on this, probably 6 months. And this would likely be where the biggest hangups would occur that could delay even further, and in the neighborhood of $160,000. User interface incorporation with existing software, at least a year, and something like $5 million based on, and this is again based on conversation with the data owners currently, at least some of them. An operator training, 6 months, probably about $35,000. This allows at least one site to start implementing for test the augmented reality. So we're looking at about 22.5 months, about 2 years, and about $5.2 million for the Air Force to begin implementing for test augmented reality on the MQ-9 specifically as a case. What I would anticipate is that aircrew of both crew positions would experience enhanced attention flow, which would lead to safer and more effective missions. I expect that the aircrew, they perceive new efficiencies in the GCS's situational awareness tools, and that aircrew of both crew positions process spatial data representation faster and more accurately. How will I know? How will we know if it works? Every aircrew in the Air Force completes operational risk management reports. I would expect that those reports, after implementation of augmented reality, would show less physical and mental fatigue, which are quantified and can be reviewed. I would expect less hazardous air traffic reports are submitted involving ISR aircrew because of greater spatial awareness of what's around them. I would expect less near misses, which are not a hazardous air traffic report because they an incident did not actually occur, but I would expect less of those as well. I would expect a lower percentage of positive identification lost in ISR missions. And that's where aircrew have gained positive identification of a target for some amount of time, but then due to some external stimuli, lost that target, whether that was because of terrain masking or lack of situational awareness of where the target might go, or poor pattern of life analysis. I'd expect to see a much lower percentage of that, and I would expect to see higher percentage of ground force commander intent met on mission outcomes, which is really just the military intelligence, surveillance, and reconnaissance way of saying you accomplished the mission successfully. So like I said, this is kind of a more conceptual framework that I have not been able to implement. You'd expect 596B to usually be a presentation of what I've found at the end of implementation, and mine's not that way. But at this time, that's what I have. I'm open to your questions.
All right, thank you, Mark. That was a very fascinating talk, and I wouldn't worry about the fact that you weren't able to actually implement what you've got in mind. I think what you presented here, I can certainly see being a really nice finishing point. And I hope that you have had an opportunity, or you will soon, to present this to decision makers. I guess I'll go first. Do you have any connection to the, it sounded like you kind of got into this in your timeline. Do you have any connection to the kinds of folks who would be implementing your recommendations, and did that enable you to have a sense of how feasible your recommendations are?
Yeah, military bureaucracy at this level is probably not unlike any like major Fortune 500 corporation, in that all the people who have the skill and ability and motivation to accomplish this type of data relationship are absolutely willing and able to accomplish it, and the bureaucracy above prevents the action takers from taking the action. And so that's kind of where I find myself with this is, yeah, I do have connections with the people who could, if directed and approved, implement this kind of relationship. And that's sort of what the timeline is based on, which is why it's optimistic.
Okay, good. Looks like you've got a question in the chat box.
Yeah, Wesley asks, is this geared toward both the pilot and the sensor operators, or just the pilot? Would there be a difference in the AR experience between the two entities? It is geared toward both the pilot and the sensor operator. The pilot pays more, I won't say the preponderance of attention, but pays much more attention during all phases of flight to the sky, what's going on in the air. The sensor operator pays much more attention to what's going on the ground, but both crew members are able to access either view and all of the current data associated with that view. So it would really be the AR experience would be, the framework would be the same for either crew member. The functions that they choose to use would probably be different based on their approaches to the mission set. I'd expect the sensor operator would become much more familiar with any ground-based data, and the pilot would become much more familiar with air-based data.
Other questions for Mark?
All right, thank you very much.
Yeah, thank you for a really, as I said, a very fascinating talk. It's really cool to have a look into the world that you folks in the Air Force live in. So thanks as always to our audience and our presenters especially for a set of engaging talks across a range of topics. Just a reminder, you folks in 596A, please fill out the peer review form. I will I just posted again a link to that form, but make sure you fill it out for everybody except for Mark. Mark is finishing up and is not subject to that peer review. Yeah, so thanks everyone for attending, and best of luck to all you 596A students on completing your work and finishing your degrees.